Well, we're back for the third part of our exploration into grayscale. In the last episode, we converted a color image into a grayscale image, played with it a little to make it more dramatic, but ultimately ended with kind of an interesting image. But in this particular section, I want to take it further. Frequently, grayscale images are produced in a tone of some kind, particularly those like our shot, which was an old barn and some tumbleweed in front. Particularly for those, it's frequently done in a sepia or a warm tone of some kind. So in this final part, I want to show you several ways that you might go about toning an image. They all work, but they all create slightly different looking tones. There is no right way. There is no wrong way. The only question is, which of these gives you the image that you like? So here's our grayscale image one more time. This is the one we created, we converted. We have this wonderful old barn, all of this terrific tumbleweed texture in the foreground, and our job is we're going to tone it. I've already made an extra layer, but just to give us some stuff to work with, I'm going to make one more layer just to have it there. And that way it'll give us stuff we can compare back and forth. This time I'm going to leave that top layer alone. I'm going to turn off the eyeball on it, and I'm going to work on this middle layer. Some of the simplest ways to create a tone is simply to go into Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation. But you're saying, but this is a grayscale. Well, it is black and white, but at the moment it's an RGB image. It still has all of the color channels. So if we come here to our Hue and Saturation palette and click on Colorize, it now puts a color in that image. And we can take this slider and move it to almost any color we would like. And then if we move the saturation down, we can be pretty subtle in the way we wish to tone this. So one of the simplest ways to tone an image is simply with the hue and saturation slider. But there's another way. Let's cancel out of this. This time, again, we'll go to Image, Adjustments, but this time we'll go to Color Balance. And color balance gives us a really interesting way of toning, because we can not only do an overall tone, we can do a really interesting split tone, because color balance allows us to put our color just in the shadows or just in the highlights. So let's do a split tone here, and we'll do the highlights first, just because that's where I am at the moment on the highlights. So let's make our highlights kind of warm. We'll put in some red and some yellow to create this kind of brownish color. And then we'll come down to the shadows, and we're going to make those a little cooler. So we're going to create kind of a bluish. We'll bring up the cyan a little bit. Let's go back to our highlights and boost those just a little. So now we have a true split-toned image where the highlights are warm-toned and the dark tones, the shadows, are cold-toned. So the sky is cold, but the highlights are warm. It's an interesting-looking image. Split toning was very popular in the film world. It wasn't easy to do. It's incredibly easy for us to do. So those are two very simple ways. Let me show you one more really simple way to do this toning. I'm going to take our layer and I'm going to duplicate it again, just so that we have this extra. And now, if I go down to this new layer icon, remember I created a duplicate by dragging a layer onto the duplicate or onto this new layer icon. But if I simply create a new layer, I now get a new blank layer on top. Well, I'm going to go over here to my color palettes, click on that, and I'm going to create a palette that is kind of a sepia tone. Look, you can use any color you would like for this. So I'm going to say OK. And now what I'm going to do is come in and use the paint bucket tool. Click on this layer. Now remember, there's a blank layer that we're just looking through because there's nothing on it. But I'm going to fill it with this tone. And there it is. You can see it over here in the layer palettes. But you just covered up your image. Well, yeah, I did, but I'm going to solve that in a second. I'm going to create this layer style as an overlay. And I'm going to take the opacity. And I'm going to bring it back down just a little. Depending on what color I make this, I can basically tone this any color, and this allows me a way to really maintain these brilliant highlights through all of that toning. Some of the other approaches tend to put a color into those highlights, but this one really leaves them for us to see. Okay, let's do one last thing, and I'm going to introduce you to an interesting new world. In the printing world, there is a means of toning that has frequently been something looked at with envy by photographers. And it's a way of printing called making duotones or more, tritones, quadtones, different things. And it amounts to laying down a base image, usually black, and then overprinting that with a color ink layer, but a layer that has a different breakdown of where the tones go. Usually it's heavier in the shadow tones, trails off and may not even exist in the higher tones. Well, it turns out if we look up in the image mode area that there is a duotone option, but it's grayed out. It's not available to us, and the reason it's not available is that we're still in RGB color. The system cannot make a duotone with a 3-channel file. So what we've got to do now, if we're satisfied with the black and white, we've got to convert it to grayscale. Now, I've got all these other layers here, but this is the last thing I'm going to do, so I'm going to go ahead and merge them all. Then we'll discard the color information. And I'm now down to one layer, but it's a grayscale layer with a single channel, meaning the gray channel. There is no longer 3 channels here. If I look again under image mode, it's no longer an RGB image. It's now a grayscale image. It's still a 16-bit image, though. And even in this latest version of Photoshop, the duotones only work on an 8-bit image. So I'm going to have to pick 8 bits. Our image size just got smaller, by the way. But now I can go into image mode, and sure enough, duotone is available. So I'm going to click on that. And here's a good example of the way duotones work. Each of these colors, there's black and then kind of a tan and then a lighter tan. Each of these has its own curve as to how it's applied, and it creates a fascinating color look over here. Now you could go in on your own and make these, create all of these. This is a tritone. It's got 3 layers on it. But it turns out that Photoshop gives you an incredible number of potential new versions that you can use. I mean, they're all over the place here. This is the one that was last used, so it picked it up. It's the warm gray and warm gray, 2 versions of warm gray. But there are plenty of others that we can also pick up. And we can even do something weird like this burgundy and gold one. Now what's interesting with these, let's try that one. This has a different set of warm gray. If you look at these colors, they're Pantone colors. This is not the normal color picker colors from Photoshop. Pantone is a color system that's used by ink manufacturers that make ink for offset reproduction. When we make this, we would be giving the pressman the notice of what these colors are, and this would show him the curve that needed to be applied. Well, these are really unique images. You can't make these in any of the means that I've already shown you for trying to do a tone of some kind. These are unique. I think some of them are really pretty extraordinary. They're subtle. Here's one that is very, very subtle. If I change this curve a little by clicking on it, I can bring this up to where I'm putting a little more of this tone a little higher up. So I can change this a bit. But you say, well, that's fine, but isn't that going to be a problem printing it? It's perfect if you want to send this out for the web, or you want to put it on Facebook. It's a nice, reasonably small file, but you can't print it because it needs to be in the 3 channels or printers really get twitchy with it. So here's what we do. We've already made our duotone. We go back into image mode, and now we change this back to RGB color. And an interesting thing happens. Nothing happens. We now have our duotone image that we can use like any other image. We can print it. We can do anything with it that we could do with a normal image, but it's a match for that duotoned image. So with these different methods, you could make tones of any kind that you wanted. You want cool tones, you just pick cooler colors. You want some different tone, green, red, mauve, puce, anything you would like, you can do this way and create some really unique, very rich images. So that's the end of our presentation on ways to make what we call grayscale out of color images. So now you're going to get a chance to make one on your own. Should be fun. So take a look at the assignment.